China is not a socialist country. There are different reasons for why we should be making this argument, but I think the most important reason is because communism is an international project, and we have to develop solidarity and unity with the international proletariat, and that includes the Chinese proletariat in their struggle against capitalism. I just want to quote something. Today, China has become a wandering spectre. The rural world is dying, yet hundreds of millions of workers still seem stuck between their peasant past and a future that fails to arrive. 2 decades of staggering economic growth built on a series of credit bubbles have left a legacy of development defined by wastelands of apartment complexes sitting next to half-empty factory cities, each year filled with fewer workers and more unmanned machines. While the elite children of the country's financial and administrative centres collect sports cars and foreign degrees, the children of today's migrants are guaranteed little more than the fleeting chance to become yet another corpse crushed to pulp in the factory. Now, this wasn't written by a Western Marxist, it was written by Chinese communists living in China. Zhuang is a collective of Chinese communists living inside and outside of China who believe that the China question is of central relevance to the contradictions of the world's economic system and the potentials for overcoming it. Zhuang have done phenomenal work in methodically dissecting and critiquing the development of Chinese capitalism, not just from an intellectual point of view, but from a lived experience. If you want to develop your understandings about the counter-revolution happening in China and get sophisticated and nuanced critiques of the Chinese economy and Chinese capitalism, then let's read what Chinese communists are saying about it. On Zhuang's website, there are in-depth articles in English and in Mandarin, and they've also started an FAQ project that answers some of the most common questions about China. Go and check them out.
They've industrialized their nation and abolished relative poverty, which has been recognized as...
In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping had this series of conversations which somebody had written down and called "To build socialism, we must first develop the productive forces." And I mention it because in it describes a transition within a transition in order to transition. And I just think this sort of ontological loop, this transitioning into transitioning into transition, this perpetual transition, accurately describes Dengism. This is the second error that this state capitalist makes in mistaking Marx's dialectical understanding of history as some sort of strategic schematic for government policy on economics. The science of history that Marx and Engels developed, historical materialism, was about identifying how the development of productive forces revolutionized the way that human beings produce the world around them, and also how out of that came conflict between competing classes. That class conflict would ultimately transform old productive forces into new productive forces, and in the process liberating people into new ways of life. We see evidence of this conflict in the capitalist mode of production. Automation and mechanization has completely revolutionized how the capitalist extracts surplus value and fundamentally altered what it means to be a worker. As workers try to produce their life around them, they're constantly coming into conflict with capitalism's inherent contradiction, that these revolutionized productive forces aren't being used to better our lives as workers, but to simply allow the capitalists to more efficiently extract surplus value, and this creates conflict. This is what class struggle is, this tension between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it was within this class struggle that Marx saw the possibility for the proletariat to intervene in a way that could fundamentally alter the nature of society. Dengists and state capitalists mistakenly believe that that process can be artificially manufactured under the guidance of a communist party, that the development of productive forces will lead to quantitative changes in people's standard of living that will ultimately lead to a qualitative shift and determine the outcome of socialism. This economic determinism reduces revolution down to an economic formula and rejects the importance of proletarian revolution into class struggle. But Marx rightly points out that it's not the development of the productive forces that will ultimately liberate us, but the abolition of the conditions that give rise to the proletariat in the first place through the proletariat intervening into class struggle. History defined as class struggle is open-ended with any number of possible endings and continuities. Productive forces are inherent to all modes of production, but to interpret the outcome of their development as some determined historical or ontological destiny is mistaken.
Capitalism is supposed to be the real process of abolishing capitalism and transition.
So this state capitalist makes many errors, but I'm going to talk about two of the most fundamental errors that he makes. Firstly, there doesn't exist anywhere in Marx's work this requirement for a formal transition between capitalism and communism called socialism. It doesn't exist anywhere in Marx's work. Marx uses the term socialism and communism interchangeably. For him, they meant the same thing. The transitional phase as a specific form was an innovation made by Lenin to reconcile the revolutionary aspirations of the proletariat in 1917 with capitalism as it existed in that particular historical moment. What Marx does talk about very briefly are temporal processes that would exist between capitalism and communism, and he says this about it. Between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So firstly, when Marx uses the word period, he's talking about a temporal process, not form. Secondly, Marx defines the state like this: the proletariat organised as the ruling class. He goes on to clarify, it means that so long as other classes, especially the capitalist class, still exist, as long as the proletariat struggles with it, it must employ forcible means. Marx is not identifying a form that the state should take, he's describing its function. What's really crucial to understand here is that Marx is talking about two separate processes. He's talking about a political transition where the proletariat suppressed the bourgeoisie, and a social transformation where the capitalist mode of production is transformed into a communist society. In criticising Bakunin statism and anarchy, Marx describes this process. The proletariat is itself still a class, and the economic conditions from which the class struggle and the existence of classes derive have still not disappeared, and must forcibly be either removed out of the way or transformed, this transformation process being forcibly hastened. In other words, the conditions that give rise to class, i.e. capitalist relations of production, either have to be forcibly removed or transformed in a process that has to be done quickly or forcibly made to be quick if necessary. Marx knew that if the proletariat was to be victorious, this process of transformation had to begin by immediately abolishing capitalist relations of production and the political suppression of the bourgeoisie. And Lenin knew this too. That's precisely why between 1917 and 1921, the Russian workers socialized all land, abolished private property and landlordism, created workers' council, democratized production and distribution, and even began abolishing commodity production and money. The argument that we cannot immediately begin the process of abolishing capitalist relations of production is just false. History has shown us that. And that brings us on to this state capitalist's second fundamental error. So watch part 2 for an explanation.
Transferring the means of production to the workers, it's just not immediate, like you're demanding it be.
I'm not making any demands on the Chinese state. That's not the purpose of my argument, and it's not what I've said. I'm not condemning China for not being socialist, and I'm not condemning China for not having abolished the conditions that give rise to the proletariat immediately, because that would be a completely pointless thing to do. What I'm criticizing are Dengists for making the argument that China is undergoing some form of transition to communism, because it isn't. The Dengist argument that developing productive forces will result in socialism is what's being questioned here. Dengists have rejected Mao's view that class struggle has to continue and intensify as part of social and political transformation of society, and argue that it's through changes to the productive forces or an increase in the standard of living that will determine socialism. But as this state capitalist points out when he talks about the qualitative changes that brought about the Chinese Revolution, it's because it's the proletariat intervening in class struggle, which is what a revolution is, that brings about qualitative change. In the speech that Marx gives about the Paris Commune, he says this: the working class did not expect miracles from the Commune. They have no ready-made utopias to introduce by decree. They know that in order to work out their own emancipation, and along with it that higher form to which present society is irresistibly trending, they will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historic processes transforming circumstances and men. In other words, communism comes about through the proletariat emancipating themselves by transforming the conditions that give rise to their existence. It's what Engels calls in Scientific Socialism the historical mission of the modern proletariat. And this is precisely why Dengists need to be criticised and condemned and rejected, and why the Chinese proletariat need to be supported in their class struggle against revisionism and against capitalism. Revolution in China can bring about qualitative change that is lasting, not just for the Chinese proletariat, but potentially for the international proletariat. A revolution in China will change the world.
I recommend you talk to some communists in China about how they view their own system.
Okay, let's do that. The country seems nonetheless driven ahead by an undead mechanical momentum. Workers are laid off with nowhere to return. Ruralites give up their land in exchange for a fraction of the condos built on them, soon losing their value to an inflating currency. Entire landscapes are poisoned by decades of rapid industrial expansion, while urban centres succumb to man-made landslides, earthquakes and chemical explosions. Riots and strikes proliferate but fail to cohere into anything larger. The working class has been dismantled. Nothing is left today but dead generations united in their separation, shambling through the fire and the dust. I'm assuming they're not the communists you're talking about.
Socialists who don't support actual existing socialism, the Cubas.
The notion of supporting these countries is completely amorphous. What does it mean to support countries like China and Cuba? I mean, I support their struggle against American imperialism, but I, as a communist, absolutely don't support the political and economic policies that they're pursuing. Is that me telling them that they're doing socialism or communism wrong? I mean, I suppose you could say that, but if you believe in revolutionary democracy, as Lenin and Marx absolutely did, then you have to accept that there's going to be dissent and criticism. I mean, are we really saying that countries like North Korea and China are completely above criticism? I mean, I just don't understand why you would take that position. In an article that Marx wrote in 1848, he talks about how if there isn't revolution in Great Britain, which was the global hegemonic power at the time, then revolutions in other parts of Europe won't be successful. With the success of, Chinese economic policy, with the success of the Belt and Road strategy, with its huge economic advancements over the last few decades, China is a global superpower and will eventually threaten America's hegemonic position in the world. And so China becomes central to understanding how global revolution, proletarian revolution, will be successful. And so for me, it's really, really important to think about China as central to our understanding of future success, the liberation of the proletariat and the production of communism. If we don't have the Chinese proletariat with us, as Marx thought about Great Britain, I'm not sure whether we can be successful. And so it's really important to criticize other Marxists who consider China to be upholding some sort of principle or consider it to be some transitionary in some transitionary stage towards communism, because it's not. And this undermines the real historical mission of the Chinese proletariat. So I think it's important to criticize these people for the things that they say, as well as upholding and defending the Chinese proletariat in their class struggle, in their workplaces, in their communities, against the Chinese state. And so that's why I make these videos, and that's why I focus on these situations.
Critics of socialism will try to distract you from
This person just said that anyone who says that China is state capitalist is a critic of socialism. I see what you tried to do there. I see you. First of all, command economies, mixed economies, and state ownership is not unique to socialism. Absolute monarchies and fascism have used command economies, state ownership, and hybrid economies. Secondly, bringing people out of poverty is not unique to China. In the West, in Europe particularly, the welfare state has been very effective at bringing people out of relative poverty. China to be a genuinely transitioning society, it would have to be transitioning from capitalist relations of production to socialist relations of production, and it is not doing that. The simple fact of the matter is you can't have socialism in one country. You can't build socialism in one country. The idea that you can create a transitional society as an island within capitalism is just false. Chinese proletariat are just as exploited as the American proletariat, and they'll need another revolution. Just on my lunch break, but I wanted to respond to this comment. Chinese imperialism, I'm not really sure what that means. I understand what the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy aims are. I'm not sure whether that's the same as imperialism. I'd have to be convinced of that. But even if Chinese imperialism existed, it's certainly not morally equivalent to the United States. This is a country that has invaded Iraq, it invaded Vietnam, it topples democratically elected governments such as Salvador Allende. It props up brutal military dictatorships, all in the service of exporting, through violence, covert and overt, its political and economic system and its military might. The idea that flying a spy balloon over mainland United States is sort of morally equivalent to CIA black ops or, you know, the invasion of Iraq or something is obviously ridiculous. And I know that's not really what you're saying, but the point is that the US and foreign and military policy has had a decade-long history of violence around the world, and I don't think that you can say that about the People's Republic of China. Criticism of US imperialism has to be different to criticism of any imperialism that we think the People's Republic of China are participating in. It's necessary to point out specifically the US when these things happen as hypocrites, because they're the biggest imperial power in the world, and as anti-capitalists and as communists, they pose the biggest threat to realising those ambitions, and that's why it's important.